In this chapter on listening, we will describe how effective listening can contribute to your career success and how some of the false assumptions that we have about listening could impede your career. I know listening might not sound like the quote-unquote sexiest topic around, but it's very, very important. It will also be able to identify 3 major barriers to listening and some strategies. We'll work on some strategies for overcoming those barriers. We'll analyze our listening styles and through our conversations, explain how you might use this knowledge to understand other people better. There are some guidelines here that will also apply to listening to understand instead of listening just to hear, and we'll be able to create appropriate paraphrasing responses or approaches in certain situations. And we'll also look at some guidelines with regard to the evidence and the appeals that are used when listening to evaluate someone's message. So to kind of back up the concept that listening is much more important than I think most of us give it credit, in numerous studies, listening has proven to be one of the most important communication skills throughout one's career in terms of job success, career success, productivity, mobility, organizational effectiveness, as well as happiness. I mean, when you think of somebody saying you need to have great communication skills within an organization, you typically think of somebody who either writes well or presents well. Maybe they're a very effective verbal communicator. But we need to focus our attention in this chapter on some of the inward bound messages, how we handle them, and that really leads us to our investigation of listening as a skill, active listening versus passive listening. Listening, as we know, is very valuable even before you get started. This is a good example, this type of course, your ability to listen to these lectures and internalize the message goes a long way to success in your coursework as well. But, despite the importance of understanding other people, we understand that it's important to understand others and their messages. The research that we have access to suggests that misunderstandings are more typical rather than just being the exception to a situation. Partners engaged in communication, your dyadic communication, when you go think back to your communication model, your 2 people sending and receiving messages, typically achieve more than 25 to 50% of accuracy in the interpretation of each other's comments. So it's that receipt of that message, the internalization of that message, and the interpretation of that message that we usually get right about 1 out of 4 times or 1 out of 5 times. The research we also look at indicates that immediately after a 10-minute presentation, a normal listener can only recall about 50% of the information presented. I even think I think that's on the high end, 50% over after 10 minutes. I would imagine it would be 10 to 20% over a 10-minute presentation. It also depends on how good the presentation is. After a couple of days, though, the recall level drops to a very, very small percent, 10, 15, 20%. As you look back from your earlier lectures, there are many kinds of noise that get in the way of receiving messages. And remember, there are the things like the environmental noise, the physiological noise, and the psychological noise. These all get in the way of how well we interpret the message, how accurately we interpret the message, which then further indicates or stipulates the extent to which we can effectively act on that message. When we think about the environmental noise, we might think of maybe a sales floor or a restaurant if you work in a restaurant, or maybe a very busy office is probably a great example. And all the conversational buzz, the work that's going on in a crowded room can make it very hard to hear and process messages. Now, not all environmental barriers are about sound, and maybe an overheated office or an overheated classroom, terribly uncomfortable chairs can also make it very difficult to listen effectively. Ironically, some environmental distractions come from the very tools we use to communicate. Incoming phone calls, text messages, emails, updating our status on one of our social devices can really distract us from focusing on a conversational partner. For some people, poor listening skills come from actual hearing deficiencies. They don't hear too well, but once recognized, they can usually be treated. Other hearing problems, with air quotes around that, such as an earache or a headache, those are temporary. Now, whether the problem is short-term or permanent, the effects can be problematic, to say the least. Hearing isn't the only physiological barrier to listening. Processing difficulties as well, such as an auditory discrimination, sequencing, or memory can create the appearance of not listening or pay attention when the real problem rather is also physiological. For some people, poor listening results from environmental noise that can impact or be a barrier to effective listening. If you think about a busy office space, maybe a busy conference room, or a very large lecture hall, and all the conversational buzz that go on in such a crowded room can really make it hard to hear, therefore hard to listen, therefore hard to process the message appropriately. Now, not all environmental barriers are about sound, however. Maybe an overheated office or a classroom that is too cold, maybe uncomfortable chairs can also make listening very difficult. Ironically, though, some environmental distractions come from the very tools we use to communicate. Maybe the incoming phone calls, text messages, and emails, or maybe the need to respond to an update on a status request or a status notification can distract us from focusing on conversational partners and the message being sent. For some people, though, poor listening results from actual hearing deficiencies. It's not usually the case, but once recognized, they can usually be treated. Other hearing quote-unquote problems, such as earaches or headaches, those are temporary. So whether the problem is short-term or permanent, the effects can be problematic. Hearing isn't only physiological, or rather it isn't the only physiological barrier to listening. Sometimes there are also processing difficulties, such as auditory discrimination, selecting only to listen to certain parts of a message, sequencing, taking in the message but getting it out of order when you try to reinterpret it, or memory, short-term memory, can create the appearance of not listening or pay attention when the real problem, however, is physiological. Another barrier to effective listening could be preoccupation. Business or personal concerns can make it difficult to keep your mind on the subject at hand, even when your current conversation is important. Other unfinished business can divert your attention. Maybe the call to an angry customer or a colleague, questions your boss asked about your schedule delays, maybe a new supplier you heard about and you want to interview, and the problems you have with the babysitter or the auto mechanic. These are all things that indicate preoccupation. Egocentrism is another one. The preoccupation with how the message relates to me. What is this? How does this impact me? And what is my response going to be? And then finally, the fear of appearing ignorant. You're listening, but you're not going to respond because you want to kind of keep the message to yourself and keep your interpretation of yourself, because just in case you're wrong, you don't want to give the appearance that you weren't listening and that you don't know what's going on. This is one of the trickier slides or the trickier concepts to address and explain, and I'll walk through it. But one of the false assumptions this chapter puts forward is that the effective communication is the sender's responsibility. And what it means here, though, is yes, it is the responsibility of the sender to ensure that their message is encoded correctly and that the message is sent in an effective fashion. And all of the mechanisms are in place, such as a shared interpretation or a shared understanding of the symbols used to make it easy and accessible for the receiver to interpret the message. In other words, it is still the sender's responsibility to make sure that the message is sent and interpreted or received effectively and correctly. But what we're getting at here by saying that's also a false assumption is it's putting the onus or the responsibility as well on the receiver. And that's an interesting twist on this, that even though the message might be sent, it is the responsibility of the receiver to also listen and try to interpret the message, possibly ask for questions, possibly paraphrase and repeat it back to ensure that they understood it correctly. So it might say it's a false assumption to say that the effective communication is the sender's responsibility. That's a little bit shortcoming there. Because it still is their responsibility, but it's equally the responsibility of the receiver to ensure that they understood it correctly and or took steps or measures to ensure that the message was resent in a more learnable fashion. The next one, learning is passive. No, learning is not passive. That's hearing. The fact that my ears are picking up sound, that's a passive act. Listening is to critically interpret and try to digest and internalize the message. That is an active skill set. Talking has more advantages is obviously one of the more false assumptions. That 80-20 rule, anytime that you're talking 80% of the time, the other person is probably only listening or interpreting about 20% of what you're saying. So the listening is the listening is the more important of the two to ensure that the correct message is heard, interpreted, and acted upon. We've all seen those magazines at the grocery store that are fond of posting on their cover page or in their slick, glossy pages stories or little fake quizzes about who listens better, men or women. This question isn't really as helpful as asking, in what ways do men and women listen differently? And this is an interesting concept here. For one, and this is right out of your text, women and men tend to interpret listening noises such as They tend to interpret those differently. Women may use them as a signal that they're paying attention. Men use them to signal agreement. So when you hear them coming from different genders, they mean different things. So when a woman says, they may mean that they're listening, and it might not necessarily indicate that they're agreeing, While a man hearing the same thing, got it, would think that he or she agrees, that the other person agrees. Once the communicators are aware of the differences like these, it's easier to clarify the meaning of ambiguous vocal cues. So you seem to be, okay, cool, a good question you're going to send the receiver. You seem to be interested in the idea I'm presenting. Is that right? Are you agreeing that we should get started on this? That is much more clear, much less ambiguous and open to interpretation than just assuming that an or I got it means that they agree with you. Not everybody listens in the same fashion. The research that we have access to in our textbook has identified that people have a general listening style, or people have a general or a particular motivation for listening. An effective listener is flexible. Relational listening is one type of skill or one type of motivation for listening. People who are primarily focused on relational listening are more concerned with emotionally connecting with others. They understand, or they listen rather, to understand how other people feel. They're usually aware of their emotions, and they're highly responsive to those individuals. Relational listeners are usually non-judgmental about what other people have to say. They're more interested in understanding and supporting people than critiquing them or critiquing the message. Another motivation for listening. People who are more interested in analytical listening are concerned about attending to the full message before reacting or coming to a judgment. They want to hear details and analyze an issue from a variety of perspectives. More than just enjoying complex information, these listeners have a tendency to engage in systematic thinking. Another one, task-oriented type of listening. So people who are inclined to task-oriented listening are most interested in getting the job done. Efficiency is the biggest concern. They expect their partners, their speakers, to get to the point quickly and to stay on topic. Not surprisingly, task-oriented listeners are often very impatient. I can tell you from my own professional experience as a manager, I am absolutely not a relational listener. I'm not trying to be impersonal, but I don't have time for that. It seems a little warm and fuzzy to me. I am absolutely a task-oriented listener, and to a less extent an analytical listener. So when I'm working with people on my projects, I need to know how to get from point A to point B quickly. What are the steps necessary? That's analytical, and do it as judiciously as possible. I don't need a lot of context. Get to the point. And I get sometimes frustrated with the people I'm working with on their teams, because I need to know the tasks at hand for the project we're working on, and then either I or as our team, we can analyze the details. So this is a very real way of the people in organizations communicate or listen rather, and the different ways that people listen can be very impactful on the success of a project. So now that we know the motivations, a few of the different types of motivations for listening, we also have a few different levels of listening or levels or types of listening. Mindless and mindful. These are a very key concept that come up in many, many texts and many articles and journal articles and books about listening. Mindless listening occurs when we react to the other person's message automatically and routinely without much mental investment. It's much like listening to the radio while you're driving. You hear it, you're vaguely paying attention to it, but you're not critically evaluating it. You're just doing it. The term mindless sounds negative, but sometimes this sort of low-level processing can be useful because it frees us to focus our minds on messages that require careful attention. The challenge, of course, is to pay just enough attention to decide which message needs more careful attention. By contrast, the mindful listening involves giving careful and thoughtful attention and responses to the messages we receive. So it's not necessarily a bad difference between the two. Mindful is more preferred, although it is more taxing and tiring and takes more time than mindless listening. But again, mindless listening has its place when we simply need to react to a simple message sent that requires only low-level processing. So we've covered a lot of space when we think about listening, and we can now look to what we should do to listen better or to listen more effectively. And one of them is listening to understand. I love the phrase, seek to understand. The desire to seek understanding when you're engaged in a conversation with somebody and seek to understand what their message is, what their intent is, what their motivation is, what their goals are, what their state of mind is before we respond. Now, most of us would claim that we always aim to understand what other people are saying, but with just a little introspection, we'll show that it's often a focus that we have on other tasks, maybe mentally or overtly arguing with the speaker. Listening to respond instead. So instead of listening to understand, many of us, and I'm guilty of this as well, while we're listening to somebody, we're crafting what our response is. And that's a bad habit. And I know I'm very guilty of that. Is when we're working with a team, or we're working with a colleague, or when we're working with a family member, instead of listening to understand or seeking to understand, we're seeking or listening so we're able to address and respond. So maybe there's daydreaming instead, or maybe we're thinking about other tasks and so on. So following the advice here can really help your accuracy in listening mindfully to the message by seeking to understand instead of listening so you can craft a response. One of the strategies that is very helpful in developing our ability to listen to respond is the skill of paraphrasing. It's very powerful. It involves restating a speaker's ideas in your own words, and we do this to make sure that we understand them correctly and to show them that the other person that we're listening. Paraphrasing is often preceded by phrases like, all right, just let me understand, or just help me make sure I understand what you're saying. And it's a very effective strategy. Or maybe it's something like, all right, so in other words, what I hear you saying is blah, 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 blah. Is that right? So, and when you paraphrase, it's important not to become just a parrot and repeat them verbatim. What you're doing is you're internalizing the messages. You're making them your own. And the understanding, though, comes from translating the speaker's thoughts into your own language and then playing them back to ensure their accuracy. And after paraphrasing, it's important that you invite the speaker to validate or verify that your paraphrasing was correct so that you know and they know that you accurately understood him or her, and to clarify the paraphrasing and clear up what you may have misunderstood. So it goes something like this. Great, Stacy, let me make sure I understand what you're saying here. Or, in other words, what you're saying is that correct? Or did I get that right? Very powerful way of attenuating to the other person that you were listening, and also validates, hey, yeah, you got it right. Another skill we can work on for our listening is to attend or pay attention to nonverbal cues. Focusing on a speaker's nonverbal cues may tell you more than his or her words. Watch for these iceberg tips or these clues that help you know if the speaker might say more, especially if encouraged to do so. And then refer to your chapter, though. Chapter 4, I think, in this text explains in detail, and we'll get to this later, the wealth of nonverbal cues that are always available to you. We'll be looking at things like the gestures, the posture, the tones, the facial expression, and more. And those, when intended to, will help us focus on those messages because we know what to look for. And they'll tell us more, oftentimes, they'll tell us more than what he or she is actually saying with their words. And then finally, the final strategy we have to help us listen more effectively is listen to evaluate. So we had listen to understand or seek to understand, and now we have listen to evaluate. Once you're sure you understand a message, you're ready to evaluate its quality. This is that analytical part I was talking about. Most evaluations are based on two levels of analysis. You're either looking at evidence or emotion. First, when you look at their evidence, as a listener, as a good listener, you need to ask yourself several questions about the evidence the speaker gives to support his or her statements. What evidence does the order fulfillment manager, for example, give that the current computer system is causing problems or that the new one will be better? Maybe does a sales representative back up the claims that a product will pay for itself in less than a year? So you're being presented with a message, you're seeking to understand it, you're validating that you interpreted it correctly. Now you can listen to analyze or to evaluate their evidence. Another strategy in listening to evaluate is to examine emotional appeals. Sometimes emotional reactions are a valid basis for action. The sympathy we feel for underprivileged children, for example, might be a good reason for donating money to a particular charity. Or maybe the desire to cut down on your own fatigue may be a good reason to hire an assistant. So what we've covered off on today, we'll go ahead and stop here for our lecture. So what we've covered today is many of the strategies that we have in terms of listening, how to improve listening, and we've overcome or debunked, if you will, some of the misconceptions of listening. We've wrapped it up at the end with a few things, a few tips we should try next time when we are engaged in a listening conversation or in a conversation with another party. What we can try to do, we can listen to understand, we can paraphrase, and then we can finally evaluate the message.